The Velanthos Prime was a giant ship that carried travelers across the stars, and on this particular voyage, it held over 3,000 beings from 47 different species who were all going about their own business, without any idea of what was about to happen to them. Kethforin walked through the common deck with his 4 eyes scanning every corner and every face, because that was his job as the chief of security on this vessel. He stood almost 8 feet tall with thick blue scales covering his body and muscles that could crush metal if he needed them to. And he took great pride in keeping everyone safe during these long journeys through space. He carried a datapad that showed him information about every passenger on the ship, and he liked to sort them by how dangerous they might be if there was trouble. The Gorax miners were always at the top of his list, because they were massive creatures with arms like tree trunks and tempers that could explode without warning. He watched 3 of them playing a card game in the corner and made a mental note of where they were sitting. Next came the Velani diplomats who looked thin and weak but could reach into your mind and make you see things that were not real, and Kethforin always felt uncomfortable when he walked past them. Then there were the Sithrak merchants with their forked tongues and venom glands that could kill a person in minutes if they wanted to, though they rarely used such methods because it was bad for business. He continued his patrol and checked off each species on his mental list, feeling satisfied that he knew exactly who could cause problems and who could not. This was what made him excellent at his job, or so he believed with complete confidence. Then his eyes passed over a human female sitting alone near the window, and he barely gave her a second glance before moving on to more important concerns. She was small and plain with brown hair pulled back in a simple style, and she wore clothes that were neither fancy nor memorable in any way. His datapad told him her name was Alara Vance, and that she worked as a xenobotanist traveling to the frontier colonies to study plants. Kethforin almost laughed at how unremarkable she was compared to everyone else on this ship. Humans had no claws and no fangs, and no armor on their soft pink skin. They could not read minds or spit venom or lift 10 times their own weight, and the Galactic Union database listed them as threat level negligible, which meant they were basically harmless. He walked right past her without another thought, and went to check on the engine section, where the real dangers might be hiding. Alara did not look up from her datapad as the security chief passed by, but her eyes had already taken note of everything about him. She knew how many weapons he carried and where he kept them, and she had counted his steps to measure how long it took him to complete his patrol route. This was simply how her brain worked after so many years of living in dangerous places, where noticing details could mean the difference between life and death. She appeared to be reading an article about soil composition on frontier worlds, but her attention was actually focused on a group of passengers scattered around the common deck. There was a merchant near the food station, whose hands were too smooth for someone who claimed to work in mining equipment sales. There were 2 travelers by the elevator whose eyes kept meeting in brief glances that looked casual but followed a pattern. There was a tall figure near the security station who kept checking the time on his communicator, even though he had nowhere to be. Alara sipped her tea and turned a page on her datapad, and gave no sign that she had noticed anything unusual at all. The tall figure was named Vexal, and he was the leader of 30 Korathi pirates who had spent months planning this operation. The Velanthos Prime was carrying a cargo of rare minerals worth billions of credits, and he intended to take the ship and everything on it for himself and his crew. They had boarded at different ports over the past week, each one disguised as an ordinary traveler with forged documents that had cost a fortune to create. Vexal looked around the common deck and felt a surge of confidence because everything was going according to plan. The security team was small and focused on the obvious threats like the Gorax and the Velani, which meant they would never see the attack coming until it was far too late. In just 16 hours, when the ship entered its night cycle and most passengers were asleep, he would give the signal and his people would strike. He glanced at the human woman reading by the window and dismissed her completely, because she was clearly nobody important. His intelligence files had told him which passengers might cause problems, and humans were not even worth mentioning in those reports. They were weak and fragile and scared easily, which made them perfect hostages but terrible threats. Alara felt his gaze pass over her and kept her expression perfectly neutral as she continued to read. She had already identified him as the leader based on how the others positioned themselves around him without appearing to do so, and she had estimated that there were at least 25 conspirators on board based on the subtle patterns she had observed over the past 2 days. She could have gone to the security chief with her suspicions, but she had learned long ago that people rarely believed warnings from someone like her. They would look at her small frame and her quiet voice and her unremarkable appearance, and they would assume she was imagining things or seeking attention. So instead she simply watched and waited and prepared for whatever was coming. This was what humans did best, though most other species had never figured that out. They watched and they waited and they remembered everything they saw, and when the time came to act they already knew exactly what they needed to do. It was not a flashy ability like telepathy or venom, but it had kept her alive through situations that would have killed anyone who relied on strength alone. The hours passed slowly as the ship traveled through the darkness between stars, and Alara finished her tea and ordered another cup, and continued to read her datapad about frontier plants. The Korathi pirates moved into their final positions and checked their hidden weapons and exchanged glances that confirmed they were ready. Kethvorin completed 3 more patrol routes and felt satisfied that everything was peaceful and under control. And the small human woman in the corner noticed everything and said nothing, and waited for the storm that was about to break. The ship had entered its night cycle, and most of the passengers had gone to their cabins to sleep, leaving only a few dozen people scattered around the common areas. The lights had dimmed to a soft blue glow, and the hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the corridors. Kethvorin was in his security office reviewing reports when the first alarm went silent before it could even begin. He looked up in confusion and reached for his communicator, but a stun blast hit him in the chest before his fingers could touch it. He collapsed to the floor with his 4 eyes wide in shock as 3 Korathi pirates stepped over his body and took control of the security station. All across the ship, the same thing was happening at the exact same moment. Pirates revealed themselves and pulled weapons from hidden compartments in their luggage, and they struck so fast that nobody had time to call for help. The bridge fell in 30 seconds when the captain was stunned at his own command chair. Engineering was taken when the night shift workers were surrounded before they could reach the emergency lockdown controls. The armory was breached, and every weapon was seized by hands that knew exactly where to find them. Vexal stood in the middle of the common deck with a plasma rifle in his hands and a smile on his face as his people dragged confused passengers from their cabins and forced them to kneel on the floor. The operation had gone perfectly, and not a single shot had been fired in resistance because nobody had seen it coming. Within 20 minutes, all 3,000 passengers and 200 crew members were gathered in the main cargo hold under the watchful eyes of 30 armed pirates. Some people were crying and others were praying, and a few were trying to look brave even though fear was written all over their faces. Kethvorin was thrown to the ground near the front of the crowd with his hands bound behind his back, and he burned with shame at how easily he had been defeated. He had spent years training to handle every possible threat, but he had never once considered that the enemy might already be on board pretending to be ordinary travelers. Vexal walked among the hostages and examined them like a farmer inspecting livestock at a market. He pointed at the Veleni diplomats and ordered them separated because their families would pay enormous ransoms to get them back. He selected the Thashan noble and the famous Gorax arena champion for the same reason, and he laughed when the big warrior tried to resist and was beaten down by 5 pirates working together. Then he divided the remaining passengers into groups based on their value, and he smiled because this single operation would make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. The slaves alone would bring millions of credits on the black market, and the ransom payments would multiply that fortune many times over. Alara was shoved into a corner of the cargo hold with the other low-value captives, and nobody paid any attention to her at all. There were a few other humans in the group, along with some elderly passengers and small Fenari traders who looked too frightened to move. A young Korathi guard was assigned to watch them because Vexal believed they were not worth the attention of his better soldiers. The guard was barely more than a boy with eager eyes and a weapon that looked too big for his hands, and he strutted back and forth in front of his prisoners like he was the most important person in the galaxy. He enjoyed the fear in their eyes and the power he held over their lives, and he made sure they knew that any wrong move would be their last. Alara sat quietly with her back against the wall and her hands folded in her lap, looking exactly like what everyone expected her to be. She was just a scared human woman who posed no threat to anyone and who would do whatever she was told to survive. But behind her calm expression, her mind was working faster than it had in years. She had already counted the guards and noted their positions, and she had identified the weak points in their formation. She had observed which pirates were professionals and which were amateurs, and she knew that Vexal had made a critical mistake by putting his least experienced soldier in charge of the group that contained her. She waited for an hour until the initial excitement had died down and the guards had grown comfortable in their positions. Then she raised her hand slowly and spoke in a soft voice that was designed to sound helpless and afraid. "Excuse me," she said to the young guard. "I need to use the restroom very badly, and I have a medical condition that makes waiting very painful for me." The guard sneered at her and told her to shut up and hold it like everyone else. She lowered her hand and waited another 20 minutes before raising it again with the same timid expression on her face. This time her voice was even softer and more desperate as she repeated her request and added that she was very sorry to bother him. The guard turned around to tell her to be quiet with more force this time, and his mouth opened to form the words that would put her in her place. But the words never came out because Alara moved faster than anyone had ever seen a human move before. Her hand shot up and pressed 2 fingers against a specific point on his throat, and his body went rigid for just a moment before he crumpled to the ground without making a sound. She caught him as he fell and lowered him gently so that his armor would not clang against the floor, and then she removed his weapon and communicator and restraints in one smooth motion. The other captives in her group stared at her, with their mouths hanging open in complete shock and disbelief. Alara put 1 finger to her lips to tell them to stay silent, and then she handed the weapon to an elderly Thashan man who looked like he might know how to use it. She whispered instructions to the group about staying quiet and staying hidden and waiting for her signal. Then she slipped into the shadows near the wall and moved toward a maintenance hatch that she had spotted during the initial moments of the capture. Within seconds, she had disappeared into the darkness of the service corridors, and nobody except her fellow captives even knew she was gone. The hunt was about to begin, and the hunters had no idea that they had become the prey. Vexal was feeling very pleased with himself as he sat in the captain's chair on the bridge and sent a message to his fleet. Everything had gone exactly according to plan, and in just a few hours, his ships would arrive to help him transport the cargo and hostages to safety. He imagined all the credits he would soon have, and all the power that wealth would bring him. Then his communicator buzzed with a report that made his smile fade just a little bit. One of his guards had stopped responding to check-ins, and nobody knew where he was. He told his second-in-command to send 2 more guards to find out what was happening, and then he turned back to his planning because 1 missing guard was not worth worrying about. The fool had probably fallen asleep or wandered off to find food, and Vexal would punish him severely when he was found. 20 minutes passed, and the 2 guards did not report back either. Now Vexal felt the first cold touch of worry in his stomach, but he pushed it down and told himself there had to be a simple explanation. He ordered 5 more of his people to search the area and to report back immediately with whatever they found. The 5 guards moved through the corridors with their weapons ready and their eyes scanning every shadow, but they found nothing except empty hallways and silence. Then they reached the section where the low-value hostages were being held, and they stopped in confusion at what they saw. The young guard was lying on the floor with his hands tied behind his back using his own restraints, and he was breathing softly, but would not wake up no matter how hard they shook him. The hostages were still sitting in the corner looking terrified, but one of them was missing according to the count they had been given. The human woman was gone. They reported this information to Vexal, and for the first time since the operation began, he felt real fear creeping up his spine. He demanded to know how a single human female could have escaped and taken down one of his guards without anyone noticing, but nobody had an answer for him. He ordered every guard to stay alert and to watch for any sign of the escaped prisoner, and he told them to shoot her on sight because she was clearly more dangerous than anyone had realized. But Alara was already 3 decks above them, moving through maintenance shafts and service corridors that most people did not even know existed. She had spent the first hours of the voyage studying the ship's layout and memorizing every possible path through its metal bones, because that was simply what she did whenever she traveled anywhere. She came upon a guard standing alone at an intersection, and she watched him from the shadows for 30 seconds before making her move. He never saw her coming because she approached from an angle that kept her in his blind spot, and he never heard her because she had learned long ago how to walk without making a sound. One strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his skull, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. She took his communicator and listened to the chatter of increasingly panicked pirates who could not understand what was happening to them. Then she moved on to find her next target with patience that seemed to have no limit at all. Over the next 2 hours, 11 more guards vanished from their posts without a trace. Some were found unconscious in storage closets, and others were discovered tied up in maintenance rooms. One was located hanging upside down from a pipe in the ceiling with a note attached to his chest that said, "You should have stayed home," in perfect Korathi script. The pirates began to whisper that there was a ghost on the ship, and their whispers turned to frightened shouts when they realized that none of their scanners could detect whatever was hunting them. Alara had learned years ago how to move in ways that fooled motion sensors, and she knew exactly which frequencies the Korathi used for their equipment. Vexal was no longer feeling pleased with himself at all. He had pulled most of his remaining guards back to defend the bridge and the main hostage area, and he had ordered them to shoot anything that moved in the corridors. But somehow the attacks kept coming, and his forces kept shrinking one by one. He grabbed Kethvoran by the throat and demanded to know what kind of creature could do this, but the security chief was just as confused as everyone else. He had never seen anything like this in all his years of training and experience, and he could not even begin to guess what species might be responsible. In desperation, Vexal accessed the classified Galactic Union intelligence files that he had stolen years ago from a corrupt official. He searched for any information about the human woman named Alara Vance, and what he found made his blood run cold. Most of the file was covered in black bars that hid the information beneath them, but a few words were visible through the redactions. He saw the phrase, Terran Psychological Operations, and the rating, Field Operative Class 7, and a warning that said, do not engage without overwhelming force. There were notes about something called persistence hunting and references to human endurance that seemed impossible, and there was a list of operations that had been completed by this single woman that read like a horror story. She had dismantled a slaving ring on the frontier world of Nexus 9. She had extracted a kidnapped ambassador from the fortress of a warlord who commanded 5,000 soldiers. She had survived alone for 3 weeks in the death jungles of Korax Prime, which was Vexal's own homeworld, and a place where even his people rarely lasted more than a few days. He stared at the file and realized that he had made a terrible mistake by ignoring the small human woman who had seemed so unremarkable. He had been so focused on the obvious threats that he had completely missed the most dangerous person on the entire ship. And now she was hunting his people through the darkness, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. Vexal had barricaded himself on the bridge with his 5 best warriors and 3 high-value hostages, and he refused to leave no matter what happened in the rest of the ship. He had sent a desperate message to his fleet begging them to hurry, and they had promised to arrive in 4 hours if they pushed their engines to the limit. 4 hours seemed like an eternity when a ghost was hunting you through the darkness. The lights on the bridge began to flicker without warning, and Vexal jumped to his feet with his weapon aimed at shadows that seemed to move on their own. His warriors formed a circle around the hostages with their backs together, so that nothing could approach them from behind, but their hands were shaking in ways they would never admit. The temperature started to change, growing colder in some parts of the bridge and warmer in others, until the air itself felt wrong and unpredictable. Strange sounds began to echo through the ventilation system, and it took Vexal a moment to realize that they were words being spoken in a soft voice. The words were a human nursery rhyme that had been translated into his own language, and the innocent melody made it somehow even more terrifying than any battle cry could have been. It spoke of a hunter who was patient, and a prey that never saw death coming until it was already too late. Vexal screamed into the darkness with all the fear and rage that was boiling inside him. "What are you?" he demanded. "Show yourself and face me like a warrior instead of hiding like a coward." A moment of silence followed his outburst, and then a calm voice came through the ship's intercom system. It was the voice of a woman who sounded almost kind, like a teacher explaining something simple to a confused student. "I am nobody," Alara said. "That is rather the point of everything that has happened to you today." Vexal demanded that she stop playing games and tell him who she really worked for, but Alara only laughed softly before continuing to speak. "You want to know what I am, so I will tell you a story about my species that your databases never bothered to record," she said. "Humans evolved on a planet that we call Earth, and it was a world that tried very hard to kill us at every opportunity. There were predators with teeth and claws that could tear us apart, and there were diseases that wiped out entire populations, and there were natural disasters that destroyed everything we built." She paused for a moment to let her words sink in before she continued. "We had no natural weapons to fight back with, so we learned to make weapons of our own that were better than anything nature could provide. We had no armor to protect us, so we learned to move in ways that prevented us from getting hit in the first place. We had no venom or poison in our bodies, so we learned to create chemicals that would terrify even the Sithrak if they knew what we were capable of." Vexal told her to shut up and come out where he could see her, but his voice had lost its confidence. "But our greatest weapon was never our tools or our technology," Alara said. "Our greatest weapon was that we learned to be patient in ways that other species simply cannot understand. We evolved as persistence hunters, which means we would chase our prey across entire continents until it collapsed from exhaustion, while we kept walking forward without stopping. We learned to watch and wait and remember everything we saw, and we learned to be so utterly unremarkable that predators looked right past us while we were studying exactly how to kill them." The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dim for several seconds before returning to normal. "I have been awake for 31 hours now," she continued. "I have not eaten in 16 hours. Most species would be weak and slow and desperate for rest by now, but humans can push through pain and exhaustion that would put your best warriors in a medical bay. It is not strength that allows us to do this, because we are not strong. It is stubbornness, and we have more of it than you can possibly imagine." Vexal checked his communicator again and saw that his fleet was still 3 hours and 40 minutes away. His hands were trembling as he realized how much could happen in that amount of time. "Your reinforcements are coming in less than 4 hours," Alara said, as if she could read his mind. "But I have 4 hours to work with, and I want you to think very carefully about what that means. How many of your people have I reached in the past few hours? How many more do you think I can reach before your ships arrive?" One of his warriors made a whimpering sound that he tried very hard to disguise as a cough. "I am offering you a choice right now," she said. "You can surrender and release all of the hostages, and I will make sure you receive a fair trial instead of being handed over to the Gorax champion whose honor you insulted. Or you can refuse, and I will spend the next 4 hours teaching you exactly why your intelligence files have warnings about engaging humans without overwhelming force." Vexal looked at his warriors and saw fear in their eyes that matched the terror in his own heart. But he was the leader, and leaders could not show weakness in front of their subordinates. He had to stand firm even if every instinct told him to run. "You are one human," he snarled. "I have 5 of my best warriors here, and we will tear you apart the moment you show your face." Alara sighed through the intercom, and there was genuine sadness in her voice. "I was hoping you would be smarter than that," she said, "but I suppose some lessons have to be learned the hard way." The lights went out completely, and the bridge was swallowed by darkness so total that even the emergency systems seemed to have failed. Vexal screamed for his warriors to hold their positions, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of chaos erupting all around him. The emergency lights flickered back to life after 30 seconds of total darkness, and what Vexal saw in their red glow made his heart stop beating for just a moment. 3 of his warriors were lying on the floor in crumpled heaps, and a small human woman was standing in the center of the bridge with her hands raised peacefully above her head. She was not holding any weapon, and her posture showed no aggression at all. She looked exactly like the unremarkable xenobotanist that his intelligence had dismissed as worthless, except now her eyes held a calm confidence that sent chills racing down his spine. His 2 remaining warriors raised their weapons and aimed at her chest, but they did not fire because they were waiting for his command. They were shaking so badly that their plasma rifles rattled in their grip, and Vexal knew that fear had broken something inside them that could never be repaired. "Your friends are alive," Alara said in the same calm voice she had used on the intercom. "They will wake up with headaches in a few hours, but they will recover completely. I have not killed anyone tonight because killing was never necessary to accomplish my goals." Vexal stared at her and tried to understand how one small human could have done everything she had done without taking a single life. Every warrior he had ever known believed that death was the only way to defeat an enemy. But this woman had proven that belief wrong in the most humiliating way possible. "My offer still stands," she said. "Surrender now and release the hostages, and you will receive a fair trial. The Galactic Union has laws that protect even pirates from cruel punishment, and I will personally make sure those laws are followed. Or you can refuse, and we can continue this conversation in a way that will be much less pleasant for everyone involved." Vexal felt rage building inside him like a fire that demanded to be released. He was a leader of warriors, a commander who had conquered ships and crushed enemies for years. He would not surrender to a single human female who had no weapons and no armor and no visible means of defending herself. He grabbed a plasma blade from his belt and charged at her with a scream that echoed off the walls of the bridge. His warriors watched in horror as their leader threw himself at the small woman who stood motionless in the center of the room. The fight lasted 11 seconds. Alara did not try to match his strength because she knew she could not win that contest. Instead, she moved like water flowing around stones, redirecting his momentum and using his own weight against him. When he swung the blade at her head, she was already somewhere else, and when he tried to grab her, she slipped through his fingers like smoke. She struck twice with her fingers pressed together in a precise formation, hitting nerve clusters that most species did not even know existed. Then she delivered a single blow to his throat that was so perfectly placed that he could not even scream as his body stopped obeying his commands. Vexal collapsed to the floor in a heap of useless limbs, still alive but completely unable to move. His eyes were wide with shock and terror as he stared up at the ceiling and tried to understand what had just happened to him. Alara turned to look at the two remaining warriors, who still had their weapons pointed at her. "Gentlemen," she said with a small smile, "would you like to surrender now, or do we need to continue this demonstration?" The weapons clattered to the floor before she even finished speaking, and the warriors raised their hands above their heads with expressions of complete defeat. 6 hours later, a Galactic Union patrol vessel arrived to find the Velanthos Prime secure and under the control of its rightful crew. Every pirate had been captured and restrained, and every hostage had been freed without a single injury. The patrol officers were amazed to learn that one person had accomplished all of this, while the rest of the ship's passengers and crew had been held at gunpoint. Kethforin searched the ship until he found Alara sitting in her usual spot on the common deck, reading the same datapad about frontier plants and drinking a fresh cup of tea. She looked exactly like she had before any of this had happened, like a perfectly ordinary woman who had never done anything remarkable in her entire life. He approached her slowly because he was not sure how to speak to someone who had done what she had done. His pride was wounded, and his understanding of the universe had been shattered, but he needed answers that only she could provide. "What are you really?" he asked as he stood before her. "Are you special forces or an intelligence operative or some kind of assassin that my database has never heard of?" Alara looked up from her datapad and smiled at him with warmth that seemed completely genuine. "I am a xenobotanist," she said. "I study plants on frontier colonies in places that are often very dangerous. When you spend years living in environments where everything is trying to kill you, a person picks up certain skills that help them survive." Kethforin stared at her and knew that she was telling the truth, but also knew that the truth was much more complicated than her simple words suggested. He wanted to ask more questions, but something in her eyes told him that she had already shared everything she intended to share. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saving everyone on this ship." "You are welcome," she replied. "Now if you will excuse me, I have some reading to finish before we reach my destination." She returned her attention to her datapad, and Kethforin understood that the conversation was over. He walked away with his mind full of thoughts that would keep him awake for many nights to come. When he returned to his office, he opened the Galactic Union Threat Assessment database and navigated to the entry for humans. The current rating was still listed as threat level negligible, and he knew that this rating was dangerously wrong. He added a personal note that would be attached to the official entry and shared with every security officer in the known galaxy. It was a warning that he hoped would prevent others from making the same mistake he had made. "Threat level, unknown," he wrote. "Observe the dangerous ones carefully, the warriors with weapons, the soldiers with armor, the beings who display their strength for everyone to see. But never, ever ignore the quiet ones. Never dismiss the ones who sit in corners reading. Never overlook the ones who ask politely and seem harmless and blend into the background like they do not matter. Those are the humans who have already won before the fight even begins. They have been watching you since the moment you entered the room, and they know exactly what they will do when the time comes to act. Underestimate them at your own peril, because the dangerous human is always the one nobody notices." He saved the note and sent it through the official channels, and then he leaned back in his chair and thought about the small woman who was still sitting on the common deck drinking tea and reading about plants. The universe was far more complicated than he had ever imagined, and he suspected that humans were far more terrifying than anyone would ever know. And somewhere on the other side of the ship, Alara Vance turned another page on her datapad and smiled to herself as the stars streamed past the window beside her.